I'm Rick Quinn. I'm a landscape architect. I work with Wendy at HHF Planners. I've been doing landscape design in Hawaii for about 35 years now, and I've become passionate about using native plants in my landscaping. And so particularly over the last 10 years, I've really been exploring the use of native plants, experimenting and learning. And so I want to share some of that with you. So I'm going to review, first off, what are native plants? Why you might consider using them in the landscape. What are the considerations to take into account when you use native plants in landscaping? And then I'm going to show you some quick examples of some of the native landscapes I've created at residential properties. So why use native plants in a historic landscape? Well, they tell a story, and I think they enhance the story of your property. They can tell a prehistoric landscape. They create educational opportunities. They can enhance kind of sustainable things that kind of relate in a way to permaculture. Hunter talked about using kind of systems, the ecosystem approach to landscaping that permaculture brings, similar with the use of native plants. And they're unique to Hawaii, so you're enhancing kind of the uniqueness and special identity of your property when you wrap in some native plants. So I want to talk about indigenous versus endemic. I find this kind of very important in the discussion of native plants. There's two kinds of native plants. Indigenous is from Hawaii and elsewhere. It's native to Hawaii, but it's also native elsewhere. Naupaka, found throughout the Pacific, but it's native to Hawaii. It came here ages ago, but it also inhabited other Pacific islands. That's indigenous. There's some examples here, kupu fern, pohinahina, ko'u tree. Those are found throughout the Pacific. That's an important distinction, which I'll get into. Endemic native plants are unique to Hawaii. They evolved in Hawaii. They came as a plant and then evolved into something special. They're found only here. This is an important distinction because indigenous plants, indigenous native Hawaiian plants in general, make good landscape plants. Endemic plants, by the very nature that they evolved here, they evolved to depend on an ecosystem that's very unique, that's no longer present in urban areas. Whereas indigenous native plants are not tied so strongly to a very specific ecosystem that they need mutual support from. So about 10% of the native plants in Hawaii are indigenous, and about 90% are endemic. So we have a lot of very special, unique plants in Hawaii. So indigenous, generally good. Endemic, generally not good as ornamental plants. Now, I want to emphasize the use of endemic plants in our urban landscapes, but you've got to be aware of that approach, that they need more of an ecosystem approach, not an ornamental landscape approach. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So then there's also the canoe plants, which I think are fun to incorporate into a landscape because they also tell a story and they're part of the history of Hawaii. And so the coconut palm, for instance, was brought by the Polynesians. It's not native. The banana is not native. The sugar cane, the Polynesians brought that to Hawaii about 1,000 years ago. But these tell a story and they have their place in the landscape. So the typical features of a native ecosystem, understanding that can help inform how we use endemic plants in our urban landscapes. In general, in nature, soil conditions in Hawaii are poor. And so native plants have evolved a codependency on soil microorganisms to help them overcome poor soil conditions. That's something that we've separated in our urban conditions. Generally, native soils are a little bit more acidic. Our urban soils tend to be a little bit more alkaline. there's a high diversity of plant species in close proximity in our native forest, particularly in dry forest ecosystems in Hawaii. There's a high level of unique species, and they've co-evolved with specialized soil and plant microbes. So I'm going to talk real briefly on this, but this slide here, when you walk around 4th Street Mall, downtown Honolulu, Iolani Palace, where are the koa trees? Where's the ohia lehua? Where's the sandalwood trees? Are there any that you know of? Why not? There are iconic Hawaiian trees. They're so unique and special. They don't work as landscape plants with a landscape approach. If they did, you would see them in urban landscapes, but they die. They don't, the soil is not native. It ceased to be native hundreds of years ago. The bacteria, the mycorrhizal fungus, the microorganisms are not there that they depend on, that they need that relationship with. So here's a little brief description of a plant microbiome. There's an interaction and independence between a plant and the essential microorganisms in the soil. We know that we've been learning more and more about that with human body, with the gut. There's microorganisms in our gut that help increase our immune system and help us absorb nutrients and stuff. It's the same way with plants. Now, the indigenous plants that I mentioned that are common throughout the Pacific aren't as dependent on specific microorganisms. The endemic native plants, I think, in my experimentation research shows, need that immune system that the bacteria and the soil microorganisms can provide them. So there's surface bacteria on the leaf, there's soil microbes in the soil, mycorrhizal fungus. Even plant viruses can play a role. We hear of plant viruses being bad, but there may be some roles of plant viruses. There's also something called endophytic fungus. This is a new area of research just in the last few years, given the prevalence and inexpensive use of DNA sequencing. They've learned more about endophytic fungus. Take the ohia lehua tree. In the wild, typically in a typical ohia lehua tree, there might be 60 different species of endophytic fungus in the tree. That means inside the leaf, in the stem, not in the roots, but in the stem. There's other mycorrhizal fungus in the roots. But in the plant itself, ohia lehua co-evolved with endophytic fungus, and that endophytic fungus helps it absorb nutrients, helps it fight disease and insects. And so there's an interdependency that we're just beginning to understand. It's very complex, but the takeaway is that you don't need to understand it as long as you understand a little bit about it. And I'll get into the implications that has in applying native plants in your urban garden. So how does how does that natural ecosystem inform how we approach using plants, native plants in an urban landscape? Well, one thing that I find important is that you've got to shift your sense of aesthetics. This is not an ornamental landscape. If you're trimming shrubs and managing and controlling, then endemic native plants are not what you want to use. You have to use them in a more naturalistic way where they're allowed to kind of take their natural form and growth characteristics. There'll be attrition. Some plants will die. You might need to replace them with new plants. You're not going to have a landscape that's managed to stay the same. It's going to evolve, and you've got to allow for that if you want to use endemic plants in your landscape. Now, I mentioned that indigenous plants make great landscape plants and endemic plants in general don't. There are some exceptions. There are some endemic native plants that are tough, easy landscape plants. The lolu palm, the Pichardia fan palm, any of those. There's about 10 different species in Hawaii, unique to Hawaii. The acacia, There's some other plants that work good. So, allow leaf litter on your, don't get the leaf blower and the rake out. Let the leaf litter accumulate. It's kind of important for the mycorrhiza and the microorganisms in the soil. Don't fertilize. Here's what you can do. Use mulch. Be aggressive about removing non-native weeds. Control for ants. Ants are awful for a native plant. And there's no ant species that's native to Hawaii. They change the microbiome of the soil, and they farm aphids and scale on a plant. And one thing I would encourage is to grow native plants from seed. I mean, try to have fun trying it for seed, because availability is an issue. Don't overwater. It's a common mistake. Really common, really frustrates me is planting too deeply. It's something I see time and time again for native trees. Even a few inches can be detrimental. You want to find the root flare and plant at that level. You get the plant from the nursery. It was started in a 4-inch pot, and then was upsized to a 1 gallon, and it was upsized to a 5 gallon, and every time it got deeper in the pot, and it can survive that way in the nursery. But once you plant in the ground, it's already too deep. You want to find the root flare. If you plant it too deep, it makes it susceptible to pathogens. It's lower oxygen levels that it's not used to. It stresses the plant. The microorganisms can attack the tender trunk that's now buried. Nematodes and stuff can get at it. So plant it at the root flare, please. Don't use fertilizers. You want the plant to be in, you don't want it real fertile soil, because then it doesn't need the relationship with the microorganisms. It breaks that relationship, and then when it does, then it loses its immune system. It doesn't need the microorganism for nitrogen uptake or phosphorus. It doesn't form those associations that it needs. Then it makes it vulnerable to Phytophthora, Fusarium, nematodes and stuff in the soil, because you've over-fertilized it. You don't want maximum growth. You want optimum growth. I think slower growth is better for native plants. That's why you don't want to overwater. You don't want to over-fertilize. You over-fertilize, and then you get, it becomes a magnet for insects. It's like a flare going off to attract insects. You get that high nitrogen in the leaf, and it makes it more susceptible. This is why I think we don't see that many endemic native plants, the iconic ones, in urban landscapes, because people have planted them as landscape plants, and they don't have the ecological approach that the endemic plants need to survive. So the challenges are availability in the nurseries. There's not a lot of native plants availability. There's a few resources that we've given at the end, and so you can see where to find some plants. But don't expect a lot of big mature plants that are available in large containers and stuff. It's haphazard in availability. Weed control is a big challenge. You want to control the weeds as much as you can, because the weeds can shift the microorganisms and the soil microbiome profile. They have a different relationship with soil microorganisms. They can be more bacterial than fungal, whereas native plants tend to want more fungal soil profile than bacteria. So leaving weeds in the garden can shift that soil profile away from what the native plant might need. And then be willing to change your sense of aesthetic, because it's not a refined ornamental garden that we're talking about. Here's some examples. This is the Honolulu Museum of Art. This is behind the gift shop. It's up kind of near the Doris Duke Theater. It was just a little courtyard area. There's a big mango tree. This isn't part, there's a historic landscape here, but this is not itself a historic landscape. This is kind of an add-on after a few years after the original building was built. The mango tree wasn't part of the original landscape. They had to remove the mango tree because it's damaging roof tiles and it's not appropriate. And so what we did is we expanded the planter and turned it into a native garden. This is 100% native plants. There's about 12 to 14 different species kind of packed in there. I fully expect some of this not to make it. That's fine. There's enough in there that's going to work over time. We're going to leave it, the leaf litter in there. We're going to leave the mulch. It's on a very specific, special watering timing that it's got an irrigation system, and it needs to be watered because this is an urban heat island thing. It's not part of a natural ecosystem, so we have to support it to some extent. And so this is a gravel area. There'll be a sculpture here that they're going to relocate. So it's a background to that piece of art that's going to be located there. Manoa, this is the Scheidler College of Business. As you go up University Avenue, up at the top of Miley Way, there's the business school complex. About 10 years ago, I redid the landscaping around the building. I took this one courtyard, which is between George Hall and the business school complex. This is the before. And there's just grass and some Formosan koa trees and some spider lilies there. This has been a real learning experience for me. This is it now. It's a complete native forest with using the principles of ecosystem restoration, leaving leaf litter, leaving dead things in there. I put logs in there to let the logs rot. There's a koa tree back there. There's a beautiful ohilehua tree is doing very well in there. I'm not sure how long they're going to live. Maybe they'll die soon because it's really not a native soil profile enough for them. I don't know, but that's okay. As they die, then they'll help create that soil condition that we need, hopefully, and then I'll plant new things, and slowly it'll become more and more a native condition. This is a private residence in Kahala. They have this entryway. There's no native landscape plants anywhere, but I decided to do a focused landscape, native landscape. That's one thing I recommend. Don't scatter native plants all around your yard here and there. Find a small area. Do a focused native garden there, something you can manage and control, and you can weed, and that the whole landscape is not dependent on the success of that area. So this is the before. This is the after. We changed, I'll go back again. So I changed the walkway. I made it more narrow, a little bit more intimate. And then we left a mango tree and the silver trumpet tree, but everything else under there becomes this kind of lush native treatment with pu'u ferns and ohilehua and palapalai fern and some hibiscus and stuff. And it's become really special in that, and the owners love it. And when they have guests visiting, they know there's something different here. They know there's something special about it. This is the IBM building, very historic building, designed by Vladimir Osipov over 50 years ago. It was going to be repositioned by Howard Hughes Corporation. This is the the before landscape. The before landscape didn't really have an iconic character to it. The building was the iconic thing. And so there's nothing endearing about the existing landscape. As Wendy pointed out, historic landscapes evolve and change. This had kind of evolved into mediocrity in terms of the landscape. So Howard Hughes wanted to transform it. And so this is, I interjected a native garden in one section of the one corner of the IBM building. And it's become a really special part of the building. And we created this little garden guide for it, this 2-page thing. And it was really important to Howard Hughes to be able to say, hey, look at what we did here. It's a kind of a special thing. So those examples I pointed out to you, the art museum, the private residence, Manoa campus at the business school, and the IBM building. Nobody asked me to do native plants there. The clients didn't ask for that. Interestingly enough, it wasn't on their radar. I talked them into doing it. They embraced it fully, and it turned out really nice for them. I think it worked really well. This last example I did not have an involvement with, but I'm really inspired by it. This is a Manoa Heritage Center in the middle of Manoa Valley. It's a great old historic property. as Wendy pointed out, those historic landscapes evolve. When they built the houses, there's open pasture land and farmland, but there's a heiau, a historic site on the property, and they embraced that kind of story, bringing out that story that the native plants could help enhance of that heiau and stuff. And so they did a great job, and if you get a chance to visit the Monroe Heritage Center, you can see a great use of native garden in historic property. Yeah, the question is, what are the native nitrogen fixtures? And I think that's an interesting point, because one distinction about native Hawaiian plants that's different than most invasive plants is that there's slow nutrient cycling. The native leaves persist a long time before they cycle back into the soil. The nitrogen fixers are koa is a classic one. It's a legume. Any of the legumes would be nitrogen fixers. And I know, Hunter, in permaculture, it's really important to understand the nitrogen fixtures, I would think. Ohia, well, not ohia, but ohai is a good nitrogen fixture. That's one of the two more dominant ones. There's some others, but the
nitrogen requirements are low.
No, they need nitrogen, but the microorganisms in the soil help them to with
fix it.
Right. With koa trees, there's a bacteria that helps I mean, that's true of most legumes, the bacteria, rhizobacteria that helps them fix nitrogen. And then there's native plants that help support the bacteria that then help support I mean, there's interrelationships with that, with nitrogen.
There's not a lot of koa, so I mean, something else has to start providing the nitrogen.
Yeah, no, there's other nitrogen fixing plants I'm trying to think offhand.
Flowering beach one.
Oh yeah, there's a.
But I think also that it's like low. Oh, sorry. That it and a lot of these ecosystems developed in a somewhat low nitrogen setting, so the lack of just constant nitrogen availability, I think, lends to some of the suggestions about management that you had brought up in terms of not over fertilizing and not requiring some of those things.
The other important thing is phosphorus, and our soils are low in phosphorus, and then that forms a dependency on microorganisms, again, to sequester the phosphorus for their use. We tend to over-fertilize with phosphorus in our urban landscapes. We shouldn't be doing that. Oh. The question is how often do you water? I have a you water just enough to keep the plant alive. I have a special watering for native plants. It might be different than permaculture, and I'll let Hunter speak to it. But I tend to want to do a very kind of complicated watering schedule where I water deeply and then intermittently with light watering. And so it cycles the soil moisture in the soil, and so the soil expands and contracts, and that helps create that soil it benefits the soil microorganism, that fluctuation. So, for instance, I'll water 12 minutes once a week, and then 3 minutes 3 times a week. And the 3 minutes keeps the ferns hydrated and stuff, keeps them alive until the deep watering. And I find that saves water. Ultimately, you're cutting down typical water use by 30 to 40% by doing that deep watering with intermittent watering.
And often in the gardens and so forth that I'd be setting up, we'd be doing watering for establishment. So as you're transplanting or as the plants are getting sort of acclimated, but ideally the fair amount of the design work that was involved was choosing things that are going to be fairly well adapted to the climate of the microclimate that you're in. So often wouldn't do a whole lot of subsequent watering once things are established. And there are some ways. I mean, you can also just do some sort of terraforming, right? So if you know just how water is moving through the soil, that you have, say, a mound of some sort, that you can be planting the things that require less water up at the top and things that require more of it down at the bottom. And there are some other sort of approaches that different permaculture designers have come up with in terms of that, as well as people across the world throughout time. But
Do you have advice on what to do to reduce stormwater runoff, particularly where nitrogen and phosphorus are bad for the reefs, and in particular watersheds are a problem?
so the question is, do I have a particular thing in terms of addressing non-point source pollution and stormwater runoff? I mean, rain gardens are often a portion of, particularly our partnership through PermaBlitz and Surfrider. Their program is Ocean Friendly Gardens, so it's about reducing stormwater runoff. So in some cases, that was removing hardscape, implementing sort of like swale systems that would at least slow water movement across the landscape or impound. Beyond that, I mean, there's a whole slew of other practices and so forth, I'm sure. I think mulch and some other ground covers that are going to, slow and as well as just provide a little bit of carbon to absorb and to help break down any of the other non-point source pollutants. Probably a good place to start. But again, you want to be thinking through, like, probably not the best place for your leafy greens per se, but because they bioaccumulate a lot of those things that you're otherwise would be sending off to the sea. Yeah.
Libby, this is for you. What is the procedure for getting a historic district designation?
The question is, what's the procedure for getting a historic district designation? That would typically be done through the city and county because they handle all the zoning and land use regulations. If you're in an area, like Kaka'ako or somewhere where HCDA is the designating, zoner, then it would be their responsibility to do that. So I guess it would just be, getting public involvement and talking to the right people and getting your voice heard.
Done one before?
No, I haven't. Adrian?